What's up, everybody, man? Back. Welcome to a brand new video, and today we're going to be continuing the last Godzilla Kong MonsterVerse discussion we had, where I talked about the top 5 things that need to be fixed in the MonsterVerse moving forward, aka the top 5 improvements that I think could be made to the series. So in today, I'm just going to kind of do a soft spitball pitch for what I would do with the next phase of the MonsterVerse, the phase 2 that we're currently in. Let's talk about it. Hey, as you'll see, I'm actually filling in for some of the original video, as some of the original video was corrupted while some of it wasn't, so I might be switching between me and another version of myself throughout this video. But to begin, there's obvious things that I would implement, like streamline the canon a little bit, because the animated show, Skull Island, and those novelizations and comic books, they continue to muddy the waters, so a little bit streamline canon. Then there's other things like, giving Godzilla a consistent character, which I also think is important. But then it comes down to shaping phase 2. Where do we go from here? How do we make it all work? Well, first of all, I need to make sure that Monarch Legacy of Monsters ties into the films in some meaningful way. And as I talked about in the last video, the way you do that is by creating a solid plan for where this series is headed. Arcing it out. So there's a phase 1. The phase 1 is everything up till Godzilla vs. Kong. Phase 2 is everything up until whatever you decide to cap off phase 2 with, and then phase 3 is its own little deal. If you want to go past phase 2, it's up to you. If I had absolutely no restrictions, I would do something very different than what I'll pitch for the rest of this video. I would not have done another Godzilla Kong team-up movie right away. I would have given us a break from Godzilla Kong team-ups, that way we can spare that moment and make it still like a box office event film that you gotta go see, and I would go with some lower budget solo movies in the meantime. Godzilla Minus One proved you don't need $200 million to make a Godzilla movie. In fact, Godzilla Kong the New Empire already proved that as well. I would say movies around the $100 million budget range would be pretty easy to make the budget back with, and if you have a solid story, like spend time on the script and the characters, you can do that really easily without needing to keep increasing your budget with more and more Titan action. And that's not even to say you don't have Titan action, as New Empire, the lowest budget MonsterVerse movie, has the most Titan action out of any of the MonsterVerse films. You just gotta know what you're doing in advance. Pre-plan, baby, pre-plan. So anyways, I would start out with Godzilla 3. If it were up to me, no next team-up movie. The next movie I would do is Godzilla vs. Biollante. I think that would be amazing. Dude, that's what all of us have been asking for since 2018, or even before that, since 2014. It's what most of us want. I would then do a Kong solo movie, and with the Kong solo movie, I could go in a couple different ways with it. I'll pitch later on to you guys like an idea to do a Kong Skull Island sequel, another period piece, but for now, if I was to continue progressing the narrative forward before the next team-up movie, I have a couple ideas that I think could be neat. Now, these are very fan service heavy ideas. Of course, you could do something with a brand new Titan that we've never seen before, but I don't know, I'm still into the idea of doing Toho Kaiju and, revamping Toho Kaiju with modern special effects. So either way I go with this, one theme I would be playing up, and this is something I'd play up in Godzilla vs. Biollante, this is something I'd play up in the Kong film, and this is something I would play up in the final entry of phase 2, no matter how long it takes me to get there. The important thematic quality I'd be exploring in this phase is the idea that Michael Dougherty set up in Godzilla King of the Monsters, that the past civilizations used Titans in warfare against each other. They used Titans as tools of warfare, and it's actually what turned the Titans on humanity in the olden days in the first place, leading to the downfall of the civilization seen in Godzilla King of the Monsters. What a really thematically rich idea. There's so much to do and say with that idea, so much about the corruption of nature, exploitation, human nature. It's just brilliant conceptually. So I would return to that idea, the idea that some Titans were used in warfare in the ancient days of the past, and I'd say, hey, they're not the only ones, as I would introduce another Titan. This one's like very fanficky, but a Titan for Kong to interact with, one that I've always wanted to see him interact with, and that's King Caesar, which would be a dark reflection of Kong, and I'd play a little bit more into the thematic tie-ins between Kong and King Caesar, kind of like what we should have gotten between Kong and Scar King. King Caesar would be a war-bound creature locked away in Hollow Earth, this slave of either an evil group of Iwi natives who are still alive, or one that has died but left King Caesar in a tomb that Kong uncovers or something. Somebody frees him. I think that this would be a fantastic dynamic to play up with, as Kong could directly understand and relate to King Caesar Caesar's struggles, as not only has he been used to call in by humanity to solve some of their problems in the past, but also Shimo has been the slave of Scar King for so long, and that could be a really interesting point of redemption for the character of King Caesar if he starts out as a pretty valid monster who wants to wage war against humanity both on Earth and in the Hollow Earth as a means of getting revenge for what's happened to him, but also Kong can use Shimo as evidence that redemption is possible. This would also leave King Caesar in the movie as a kaiju who could become an ally in the future, an ally to Godzilla as he was in the Showa continuity, and this could just set up a really natural enemies to friends arc organically. Also, King Caesar and Kong are so closely related in terms of biology that it'd be really fun to see this fight play out. You could then play thematically into it again with Jonah Allen's group getting a hold of King Caesar in the modern day, continuing to use him for warfare, proving his point, proving why he deserves revenge on humanity. Or maybe Alan Jonah's group uses a different Titan in warfare and King Caesar gets wind of it and is like, hey, I'm gonna put an end to that, and then Kong could be the one to mediate and be like, hey, we need to find coexistence here, you know? Have Kong become the beacon of coexistence. That would be an incredibly interesting way to move forward with this series, as Kong has a deep love for humanity and the Titans. It'd be great. You show not only how little people have changed, but also through Kong and Monarch, you show how much they've grown. Either that, or I'd go completely opposite route. Again, super fan-fiction-y here, I know. But I would go with the Bio-Titans aspect, diving full on, developing Bio-Titans head on. I'd go Gargantua mode, man. Kong versus the Gargantuas? Are you kidding me? How awesome would that be? Using DNA from Scar King and Kong, I'd have Alan Jonah's group recreate the Gargantuas from the Toho mythology. The green one, the evil one, could be made from the DNA of Scar King, while the brown one I would have be conflicted on the edge of being evil because of his influences, but I would have him be a little more good-natured, and I'd have him be redeemed through Kong. It'd also be these weird, freaky, half-human, half-ape hybrids. I think that'd just be super cool. And if you're like, hey, where's Godzilla in all these stories? Why is Godzilla not getting involved? Well, I think that's easy. You just have Alan Jonah's group lure Godzilla to Axis Mundi using an orca, and so Godzilla's out of the story for a little bit. The real gist of what I'm trying to say is I would tell stories that are thematically rich and related to the broad scheme of Phase 2. Phase 2? That's my Bio-Titan phase, baby. I'll talk about it more later. And then finally I'd go destroy it. You know, destroy all monsters mode. Destroy as the Titan killer. And so in total, Phase 1 would be kind of building out the universe, bringing Godzilla and Kong together and establishing mythology meets the modern day. That's kind of the arc of Phase 1 if you look at the MonsterVerse, as myth meets the modern day. Well, Phase 2 I would have be the dangers of Bio-Titans and the hubris of humanity. By the end of it, I'd kill Alan Jonah, man versus nature plotlines can be laid to bed, and then moving forward, Phase 3, that's where I'd introduce humanity and the Titans. They now have gotten along. Now humanity and the Titans were kicking butt together, but uh-oh, aliens, I guess that's where you would go from there. I don't really love that idea, to be honest with you, but there are ways to make it really interesting if you play up Ghidorah, Planet X, all that stuff. If you play it in a very serious, straight way, I could see it being pretty good. But you know what? I didn't get to pick what happens next. We already know a little bit, and we're going with another Godzilla Kong team up. And so that's where I'm going to turn it over to myself from the past to let him explain where I would go given the boundaries of what we've got so far, and it is a pretty different arc, but enjoy. What would I do next if I was given reins of the MonsterVerse? Well, first of all, I'd hire a producer, assuming it's not me. I would hire a producer who can head this series like every single other successful cinematic universe has. The ones that have failed, like the DC universe, didn't have a figurehead. And in many ways, Star Wars, who did have a figurehead, they just didn't have a grasp of the franchise. And then the MonsterVerse somehow is escaping for the moment, but I think we need one. We need one very badly. Someone like Kevin Feige and James Gunn who can look after this series, knowing what they're doing and saying, this is what each entry is setting up for, and this is why it's important. You know, like, this is the end goal. And so we're gonna do a couple movies that get us there, but not directly. I really love that the MonsterVerse started out as self-contained stories that also are building to a larger story. That self-contained aspect is really important. So what would I do? Well, I think the MonsterVerse has given us a very clear path. I would go with Bio-Titans. I think that's super clear where things should head. Michael Dougherty spent so much time setting up Bio-Titans and King of the Monsters. He talked about how if he was going to continue, that is clearly a theme he was interested in exploring, let alone the bombardment of setup for Bio-Titans in the novelization for Godzilla King of the Monsters. Now just return to that idea. I would make the next film about probably, I think, Gigan. I think he's a very recognizable monster. I also think it's a monster who is so kick-ass, and it's also a monster who is well established in Godzilla canon, is able to beat Godzilla. Gigan is the first monster to make Godzilla bleed, and I think that is something that should come back. I would make Gigan not a space chicken that just shows up, but instead a creation of Alan Jonah, or whatever his group winds up being in the future. I would say it's a bioweapon that they create using the corpse of a Muto. I think that could be such an interesting starting point. Or you know, a corpse of a different Titan. I think it'd be interesting if it was a Muto, considering they both have the visor eyes and they also have the claw hands, but I understand Muto's physiology are so different than Gigan's that maybe it wouldn't work. But I would make Gigan a bioweapon that they create, taking inspiration from Mechagodzilla. You know, they see like, oh, Mechagodzilla almost beat Godzilla, but obviously Jonah's group, they hate mechanical things. Their whole thing was down with mankind and up with nature, and so I would think that they would want to bioengineer their own kaiju, and maybe they'd modify it with some weaponry. Like, you can hook Gigan up with some weapons like the buzzsaw chest. He's kind of a ridiculous monster, but the MonsterVerse is already a cartoon at this point, with King Kong having a robot gloves, so yeah, go for it. I say give us Gigan. And if Gigan's not your thing, maybe Space Godzilla can be born by fusing Ghidorah's DNA, that's where the space aspect comes from, with Godzilla and Shimo to create this Space Godzilla life form that Godzilla and Kong have to team up against. I think Gigan and Space Godzilla, in some ways, both represent threats that would require Godzilla and Kong to team up against them, especially if you throw Rodan in for support again, or something like that, you know? Throw in another supporting enemy Titan for them to also have to take on. Or maybe not, because I would like to see more team-up moves between Godzilla and Kong, and in GXK, they spent so much of their time separate fighting alternate entities that they really didn't get to team up other than 2 moves where Kong jumps on Godzilla's back, and then where they baseball bat Scar King around. Other than that, they actually don't team up the whole movie. They're just fighting separate battles at the same time in the same spot. Anyways, I would establish that, you know, Bio-Titans, they're actually kind of hard to control. Dang, video got corrupted, so I'll jump in here. The next move I would do is, you know, I'm scaling back the budget, going with a lower budget Godzilla film, as I talked about at the start. This is where I go with Godzilla vs. Biollante. I would establish that Bio-Titans are a little hard to control, especially when you don't know how to aim them, so if you create like a Gigan out of the flesh and blood of a Muto or whatever, it's gonna behave in a way that you can't really predict. So what do? You introduce the human spirit, something you can aim, and through that, that's where we get Biollante. I would have Biollante be Erica, a victim of Godzilla or Kong or some of the Titans in the past, volunteering to become a human weapon against Godzilla, turning herself into a Titan. I think that'd be a really, really interesting and complex character to play up. You could also play up an internal conflict as, hey, maybe Biollante starts to realize as she's become this horrific monster that she is becoming the exact thing she wanted to stop, and so you could see an inner conflict there, a little bit what they touched on in the original Godzilla vs. Biollante, but never fully committed to. And now I'm getting a little wacky, a little wild, and a little weird. You could either do the Kong films I pitched at the start here, the Kong films that are set in the present day, pushing forward this Bio-Titan storyline, or you could push it forward in a very subtle way, taking us all the way back to the past. I would do a potential flashback film to the 1980s with our characters and cast of Kong Skull Island returning, and hopefully the creative team behind that movie as well. Again, I would keep Jonah as the grounding force of this series. Jonah is the thing that this is all building around. I know that Charles Dance doesn't necessarily want to come back, but you could recast him for the Kong Skull Island movie. You could also kill him off and have somebody else take his place in the current day. But I would have Jonah go to Skull Island in the 1980s. I would have all the characters returning to Skull Island because they're worried about what he's gonna do. They're trying to stop him. And during this, you could get Hank Marlowe back involved, and you could get a dual storyline where we explore both Marlowe's time on the island with Gunpei Akari, as well as this new plotline of them trying to stop Jonah Allen from doing whatever it is he's trying to do. And I think what he'd be trying to do is, you know, learn about the Titans and get his first taste of what they can do and seeing if he can find a way to harness their power. Obviously, that's what he becomes obsessed with. You know, something like that. That entry might not even be needed. And then I would end it all off with Destroy All Monsters, something like that. And I understand that's where the franchise should end, right? It's Destroy All Monsters. That's where you kill Godzilla. That's maybe where the franchise should end. Maybe it is. Maybe it is. Because where do you really go from here? I don't know. I guess you could introduce Ultraman or Gamera or a multiverse concept with Pacific Rim, but at this point, I think we're getting really ridiculous. Although Gamera would be pretty cool. I'd be really down for Gamera. But I think, like, if we introduce an Ultraman or a, you know, Pacific Rim crossover, I think that's where the series dies. That's where we jump the shark, at least in terms of the MonsterVerse. Or maybe you go aliens at that point. Maybe that's where you introduce the Exilians or whatever. Again, I think we're getting a little stretched thin there. But anyways, I'd end it with Destroy All Monsters. This is a movie where he can kill Jonah Allen off, but his story can come to an end as he successfully creates the perfect bioweapon, a Titan killer designed to destroy all monsters. How do you kill the Titans? You create the ultimate Titan of your own, and of course, a Titan made of the parts of all the other Titans and irradiated by one of the only things that proved to be a successful tool in killing Godzilla. You create Destroya. My post-credit scene to the last movie, whether it be that Godzilla movie or the Kong movie, would be a scale of Ghidorah recovered from Isla de Mona, electrocuted with red energy, so the audience knows, oh my my god, they're gonna finally do Destroya. So yes, I would introduce Destroya. I'd have him be a Titan killer. I would have him kill many of the 17 Titans and counting and wreak havoc in the Hollow Earth. I would have Destroya be a threat that required Godzilla and Kong and Shimo if she's still around, and Mothra and Rodan to team up against. Maybe even an Anguirus or so. And maybe Godzilla has to die here. Maybe he has to sacrifice himself to stop Destroya, in which case I would pass the baton to Godzilla's son, a much more well-defined version of the character whose powers are reined in a little bit more, so he's more engaging to watch continue. A Godzilla who we can understand these are his limits but also his strengths, and one with a very defined personality, as I would introduce a son of Godzilla in the Biollante movie, or I guess maybe this Destroy All Monsters movie, or maybe you go crazy with it and introduce the son of Godzilla in the Kong movie. That could be very interesting, especially if you establish that the baby Godzilla has a relationship with Kong, so if he ever reunites with it could be very interesting to see maybe Kong and baby Godzilla get along better than Godzilla and baby Godzilla do. I don't know. That's just all my rambling. Well, that'll do it for this one, guys. I'd love to hear your thoughts on both of my different Phase 2 pitches. I'm much more sold on my first Phase 2 pitch, but you know, playing with the boundaries of we're already going with another Godzilla Kong team up, so who are they gonna team up against? I don't know. Gigan could be pretty freaking cool. Gigan or Bagan, like so many of you guys want, or even the Griffin, or a brand new monster that kind of fits the same ordeal that I've been talking about. I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts on both of these pitches, or what would you do with Phase 2 of the MonsterVerse? Where would you take things? What themes do you think would be interesting to develop in this universe? Or is that even something you're concerned with at all? I'd love to hear down below, so comment and let me know. As always, I want to give a huge thank you to my patrons over on Patreon. It is because of the support on the Patreon that I can continue to make videos like this for you. If you want to support the Patreon, you can use the link in the description below where you can get early access to content, access to the Discord community, and more. If that's not your thing, please consider joining as a channel member. And if you've watched this far and you're not subscribed, what are you doing? Subscribe! Come on, join today! Thank you guys all for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I will see you all next time for the next one. D-Man out.